Hello, everybody, and welcome back. So, as you can tell, I'm in a little bit of a different environment here. So, we were actually displaced by Hurricane Helene several weeks ago. And so, we've been trying to operate through different Airbnbs basically, which is fine. But the real issue is that sometimes um, these different hotels or Airbnbs, it doesn't have the best internet necessarily. So we are hoping that the internet is stable, but if there's any kind of blips or if it's just not the best internet, then that's why. When we're, filming from our home studio, obviously we have the best internet. It's plugged in, all the equipment, all the stuff. So just wanted to let you guys know that. So today the lecture is on what is a soulless person or a non-player character, an NPC. And we're going to go pretty deeply into this concept. And I'll probably be live here on YouTube, Rumble, Twitter, Facebook for about 2 hours or so. And then the last portion is going to be a question and answer session, which I'm going to do with my members. So if you have any questions that arise or you want to go a lot deeper into the topic, then you can sign up for premium where I do all of my Q&As and everything, and you can go deeper into this topic with the group over there. All right. So this is going to be an anthroposophical examination using the anthroposophical system. So we're going to address questions like, can a human being actually not have a soul? Is this possible? Is it possible for a living, breathing human being to not have a soul? Does the soul stagnate in the individual? Does it basically just stay the same, or does it evolve? What are the exact stages of soul evolution from rudimentary to exalted? So, if there are stages to the soul's development, what are they exactly? So, that's what we're going to be examining today. And I'm sure a lot of you guys have heard of these different sort of words for someone who is apparently soulless or an NPC, and it's generally language that's reserved for people that seem very cold. They seem very robotic in their demeanor. They seem to be like empty in their eyes, like there's nothing there. They don't. They're cold, usually with no empathy. There's a sense that they don't have any self-awareness. And even when you look deeper, they may not have any personal agency. So they may not actually have any self-awareness at all, which kind of gives this feeling that the person may be, without a soul, feeling that way. So they're also called like drones. I've heard them being called like drones or clones or zombies, soulless people, non-player characters, NPCs, all sorts of all sorts of words for these people. So um, ultimately, those kinds of characteristics, being cold, um, having that emptiness about you, it doesn't necessarily mean in a human being that there is no soul, right? But rather indicates that there is a lack of development of the soul. So there's the difference, right? So many times when we get caught up in, conspiracy posts or going very, very shallowly into certain topics, you get like this fast food version of spirituality, and it's just not enough to operate. Like we can't operate on memes or very short little lessons about spirituality. We have to learn and understand the entire process of the soul, what the soul is, and how it evolves in the human being. So, when the soul is not developed, okay, this can be seen as lacking self awareness, and spiritual qualities actually emerge from becoming self aware. The human soul has distinct phases of development. Human beings begin in a condition of unconsciousness and over time can evolve to become conscious. So when we see somebody that seems to be operating at almost like an animalistic level, and as an NPC, if they're a human being, it's just that there's a lack of development, not no soul. I want to make that very clear because we don't want to dehumanize people. We want to understand the actual process that's occurring. So the best way to understand the phenomenon of NPCs is to recognize the exact stages of evolution of the soul from an unconscious condition to a conscious condition. And today we're even going to get into super conscious positions. And I'm going to see if I can adjust this light. Sorry, guys. Oh, can't reach it. Okay. Okay. What is the soul? So in modern spirituality, there is this idea of the soul. And it's kind of used colloquially to describe like your true self or like your higher self. But in spiritual science, there's actually a much, much, much deeper understanding of the soul and teaching about the soul. So in Anthroposophy, the idea of the soul is sort of like the energy body, often the astral body, but sometimes also referring to the etheric body. So the soul is kind of like the energy body of the human being. And that's different than in like modern spirituality where the soul is like your higher self, right? Your higher self in spiritual science is called your higher self or your I, and that works upon the soul and the physical body or upon the energy body or the sheaths to evolve them over time, to evolve the soul over time. So the I or your higher self works upon your spiritual sheaths or your soul, which is interlaced with your physical body over time, creating distinct phases of evolution, which we'll be getting into today. So the human energy body is catalyzed into different stages and conditions by the individual's I or the individual's higher self. the higher self works upon the soul or energy bodies to glorify it and transform us into basically fully realized beings. Okay, so the you could also look at it as you have sort of like a higher self. In Anthroposophy, this is called the I, the higher self. Even when it gets deeper into that realization, it can be called the true ego. It's the part of us that also is Christ. And that actually works upon our lower bodies. That works upon our astral body, our etheric body, and our physical body, creating distinct transformations. Now, these transformations of our sheaths used to be the distinct degrees of initiation before, mystery schools became captured and turned into bizarre kind of ceremonial weirdness. Okay, so eventually, even the, since we're talking about the evolution of the soul, eventually, even the physical body is transformed or transubstantiated by your higher self, by your I, by your true ego to spiritualize back into an astral form. So the teaching about how we transform ourselves is probably the most important teaching that we can learn for our time. It is so, so, so incredibly important. It's why we came here. And so when I see like things not going very deep with the idea of soullessness and stuff, it sort of is a marker of how maybe we're not going deep enough into understanding what the soul is. Though, make sure you stay with me because by the end of this lecture, I will actually be going into how a creature, basically, or how a living thing can become soulless, or how a soulless thing can come about. So I will get into that at the end of this lecture. All right. So now we understand that there are distinct stages of the soul's development. So let's dive into what these stages are. So again, I'm going to be using the anthroposophical system, but this is sort of recognized in different traditions to varying degrees as well. It's just it's very precise in anthroposophy. So the first stages of the soul's development are sort of considered rudimentary, or they're considered foundational. This is when humanity is basically first kind of coming to life, first beginning to perceive. All right. And these soul stages are called the sentient soul, okay, the intellectual soul, and the consciousness soul. So these first three stages of soul development, of human development, are foundational, they're primary. And, going further, they're also kind of a preparation for receiving your higher self or your I into your being and getting to even more exalted levels of spirituality as you move forward. Okay. After those three stages are achieved in the human being, taken on in the human being, there are three exalted stages. And these are seen basically as future stages of humanity. So the sentient soul, the intellectual soul, and the consciousness soul are basically past and then present conditions of the human being. And then these next three stages are considered higher exalted stages that humanity will reach in the future. So these sort of almost supernatural stages that human beings will reach are called the imaginative soul, the inspirational soul, the intuitional soul. Okay, the imaginative soul, the inspirational soul, and the intuitional soul. And all of these three sort of supernatural soul levels, supernatural to us anyway, are created through, again, the integration of our higher self into our lower self, or our I into our lower ego, our higher self into our lower ego. That's how these bodies are catalyzed, right? And why society can be so chaotic and we can have so many problems is often that there are people that are just on different levels of development. They're fundamentally operating from a different soul development. Now, this isn't to create weird hierarchies or say some people are better than the other. The reality is, on planet Earth, is that we are all kind of coming together and living together, but we have different levels of this soul development. And when someone is in like a different level of development, it can be very difficult to communicate actually, because your perception can be like fundamentally different. And I'm sure some of you guys are like, oh, that makes sense. Okay, so let's begin with the sentient soul. All right. So the sentient soul is sort of the beginning of human consciousness. We call that the sentient soul. The sentient soul is basically the part of ourselves, some might say the part of our astral body, the part of our sensory self that is basically bringing forth, primal impulses. Whether something's good, whether something's bad, happy, sad, pleasure, pain. It is where we experience our basic drives, our passions, our pure emotions, our raw instincts. That is the sentient soul. It's almost like an animal soul, an animal consciousness within the human being. The sentient soul also operates in a hive mind. So the sentient soul, or an individual that's operating from that place, or when humanity at large operated as a sentient soul, because we as a group have moved through these different soul levels together. We move through them together, and also we have an individual level as well. So the sentient soul is naturally a hive mind. So this is where we see humanity not individuated. We operated, and there's many people who still operate from a sentient soul capacity, and they don't see themselves as separate from their surroundings or separate from nature. They don't perceive themselves as separate from the group. There is no critical thought. There's no ability to sort of see themselves as a separate person. Okay. And at the sentient soul level, there is no sort of unique spiritual perception as we would have it now. It's really mainly, the perception is mainly in the material plane. And the development of the sentient soul is often considered to be up until you're about 14 years old. And this is why the Steiner schools were so fascinating, or the Waldorf schools are so fascinating, is when they're really brought forward in the way that they should be, they actually acknowledge the development of the soul and what it's capable of at certain ages. So you're not getting this bizarre, institutionalized education that is just made up by some people. You're actually getting an education that is, and if it's in its true image, you're actually getting something that's considering the development of the soul, which is really what education should be considering if it is to be effective. So to most people, the sentient soul level of human development may be considered soulless. That would be some, when you have an individual that's only operating from their primal drives and survivalism, that may come across to some people as being a soulless person. That may fit that label. So the sentient soul, actually, I'm going to read something from Rudolf Steiner here from GA58, The Metamorphosis of the Soul. And he says, the sentient soul can live without being much permeated by thinking. Its primary role is to receive impressions from the outer world and to pass them on inwardly. So it's directly receiving an impulse or having an experience from the external world, and it is just translating it into an inner experience. There's nothing else going on. It is also the vehicle of such feelings of pleasure, pain, joy, grief as come from these that come from these other expressions. So it's sort of like, does this is that fire hot or is it not? Does this experience bring me pain or is this, something that brings me pleasure? So this is the sentient soul. The sentient soul is where humanity begins to kind of just map out their basic needs, you could say, their basic impulses. Um, so the sentient soul is the body of pure instinct, pure desire and impulse. The sentient soul is rich in expression and experience, but is focused basically on survival. Only when the I or higher self permeates the sentient soul can it be catalyzed into a higher organ of perception. Okay, so the sentient soul does evolve in the presence of your higher self. And this is the root of all alchemy, right? We have a higher self, we have our I, which is always seeking to work upon and transform our lower self. Okay, so the next level of soul development, and this would also be for a lot of people, this would probably also qualify as somebody who is, soulless. This would probably qualify. It's called the intellectual soul. Now, the intellectual soul is kind of similar to the lower manas in theosophy or in the Eastern traditions. And the sentient soul in the Eastern traditions or in theosophy is very parallel to like the kama manas. Kama meaning the desire body, the desire soul. So sentient soul is like the kama manas in theosophy in the East, and the intellectual soul is kind of like the lower manas in the East. So the intellectual soul is describing the stage where humanity finally begins to think. Mind finally begins to break through. It's also sometimes called the mind soul or the rational soul. And thinking begins to permeate these sort of lower, not lower isn't bad, but the primal instincts of the sentient soul. And so in GA 58, Rudolf Steiner said this: when man has progressed from the stage of sentient soul to higher levels, he has permeated with his thinking and with feelings induced by thinking. So thought begins to become part of his experience. It's no longer just a primitive urge that needs to be fulfilled. Now there's a little bit of thought as to how that's going to be done or piecing things together, beginning to do sort of basic calculations, basic estimates, things like that. That begins to take place in what's called the intellectual soul. In the intellectual soul, accordingly, we do not find indefinite feelings arising from the depths, but feelings gradually penetrated by the inner light of thought. So by the time we get to the intellectual soul, it's like there is this thought presence that we've developed, that an organ of thought called the intellectual soul, that begins to analyze a little bit. So now this is also like seeing patterns in the world around you a little bit and starting to name them. But the intellectual soul is still not self-aware. So the sentient soul is not self-aware. It's not self-conscious. And the intellectual soul is also not self-aware yet. So all of the processes of thought that are going on are still rooted in survival and based on the material world and what's going on there. And so the intellectual soul also sees themselves as part of the hive mind still. There's no individuation yet. They may have thought and being able to do some estimations, some calculations based on their survival, but they're not yet self-conscious. They're not individuated yet. They still see themselves as part of the system, as an intricate part of nature. Understands So basically, they understand life in the material world, but there's nothing of the spirit world coming from within them yet. And so, how we educate the intellectual soul is when we strive for truth. So the intellectual soul begins to raise and become um, an even higher organ when we strive for truth. And that means that the individual has to sort of stop and sort of place their own personal desires aside and what they want personally, things that are coming from an egoic place, and say, okay, what is the objective truth going on here? That actually catalyzes, that process catalyzes the intellectual soul into an even higher body, a higher organ that we have. And just to bring it full circle, the sentient soul, by contrast, is educated by overcoming anger. So, specifically, the sentient soul will, if you're not careful, the sentient soul, which is desires and passions, will just control your life. Like you'll be completely governed by lower urges, and that will be completely depressing. And it's like you don't have any agency. And how you sort of evolve out of that is you have to become aware, obviously, of your lower urges and what could be coming from um, sort of like an unhealed place, which means you have to kind of overcome anger and learn to sublimate your negative emotion. You have to learn how to work with negative emotion and practice non-reactivity, observation of self, things like that. That's what evolves a sentient soul. And it is truth that evolves the intellectual soul. So the intellectual soul will collapse in upon itself and work kind of evil upon you. It'll bring to you darkness if you don't at some point in your development begin to say, okay, I'm a thinking being, but I'm not just going to think for myself. I'm going to be dedicated to finding the objective truth, and that truth is also God. And so it's that process that marks, the transformation of the intellectual soul. So the intellectual soul is the first human expression of mind, rationality, and thinking. While the individual can have basic thought processes about the material world, none of these intellectual ideas incorporate God, the spiritual world, or deeper thoughts about the self. When the highest self, the I, permeates the individual, this is when the intellectual soul begins to actually perceive beyond. Okay? So, again, the intellectual soul alone with very little development is probably going to seem soulless to people because, again, there is no self awareness, there is no self consciousness here. Okay? Now, the next phase, the third phase, and the phase that humanity is actually currently in and currently trying to balance is the consciousness soul. Okay? So the consciousness soul is interesting because it's at the level of consciousness soul that the individual finally begins to turn inward. So during the earlier stages, the human being was basically operating in a groupthink, and they were, it was mainly focused on survival and being able to perceive the material world properly. But now, when consciousness soul arises, the impulse that humanity faces is that, okay, now we have to turn inward. Now we've got to turn inward. We can't just operate in this hive mind. We can't operate from extreme egotism. It actually becomes dangerous for society. It becomes dangerous for the human being. So the senses of the sentient soul and the thoughts of the intellectual soul now begin to turn inward, hopefully. And you get the first potential spark of self-awareness and self-consciousness begin to come about. And finally, the human being begins to feel separate from the tribe. They begin to think of themselves as separate. They begin to feel they're separate, and they begin to feel as though they're kind of isolated. So the consciousness soul is really associated with a feeling of isolation as well, because now there's a distinct shift in how the human being is operating inside of themselves. And this is everyone, because all of these changes are also planetary changes that happen with the different epochs of the planet. The human being evolves according to planetary epochs, which are also in line with cosmic shifts. So every single human being is exposed at the same time to these forces, to these changes. So the 15th century, around 1413, is when the consciousness soul kind of comes about and begins to become the soul development for all of humanity. So that is also when you get this impulse of oddly enough, kind of materialism and separateness and things like that. It totally changes during that period of the 15th century. Humanity changes deeply during that time. So for me personally, I like to divide the phase of consciousness soul into two distinct cycles, two distinct phases. The first phase of the consciousness soul is completely egotistical. The second phase of the consciousness soul is selflessness. Okay, so let's get into that. So the first phase of human beings experiencing the consciousness soul and this separation, that you feel the separation from society, you start to feel yourself as an individual, you're kind of having your own unique ideas which feel different. And really, since that period, humanity is forced to turn inward and shift gears from in earlier periods, it was completely appropriate to operate in a hive mind, in a groupthink. And now all of a sudden it's like, no, that's not what's happening anymore. We have to turn inward. And so there is this really intense shift that has to happen in the human being that's actually very painful. It's painful to shift from, being almost like in a protected tribal consciousness to now being on your own. And this is what a lot of people struggle with. A lot of people remember kind of the good aspects of being in a tribe, being super communal, and they mourn it. They want to go back to that. There's a negation of being an individual and all of that entails. Other people are perhaps further along in this and on the other side of this, but there is a deep, deep, deep struggle in becoming an individual and leaving behind the sort of womb of the earlier Earth experience, which was completely feeling as though you're united with everything around you, right? See how different that is? So the first phase, which is egotistical, the first phase of the consciousness soul, which I would personally call a kind of egotistical phase, a selfish phase, is when the individual is realizing that they're an individual, they're separate from the tribe, but that kind of realization that you're an individual is channeled in sort of the most selfish and materialistic way. And even in its kind of lowest weird way, the individual can think that they're God, even. That's like the dark side of individuation when it's not done properly, right? It's not spiritualized. So their challenge is to have a direct relationship with your higher self, which is not possible in a hive mind. So In a hive mind or a group consciousness, it's not possible to have a direct relationship with your I or your higher self. The higher self is forced to work through the nebulous group consciousness, and there's no directness with it. So why this is important is because when you are at the level of consciousness soul, you're finally able to directly experience your I am, your higher self, your I, and the Christ essence within you. It's not possible to experience that in these earlier phases of humanity. So this is why that difficult shift must be made to become an individual, is because only through you accepting your individuality and aligning it with your higher self will you ever evolve, right? So the first phase, you can get that sense of individuality, but it's like the most immature sense of individuality, where it's all about consumerism. It's all about acquiring things. So it's like drawing as much to you as you possibly can. There's a draw towards the glorification of the self through worldly power, and wanting to get a bunch of external things to build yourself up. There's too much focus on just you and the material world. It hasn't yet spiritualized. So also what can happen too is this kind of remnant of the old way of being can hang on to the soul. And so you can be halfway sort of individuated, but you're still trying to engage in spiritual processes and spiritual thought that are from the group soul. So this is what happens when people try to, like, their experience becomes about disassociation. They want to project themselves out of their body to have a spiritual experience using different drugs all the time, or different methods that are not about embodiment, but they're actually about externalizing themselves, projecting themselves outward into a sort of group soul, or projecting themselves outward into a kind of experience rather than having a fully embodied conscious experience. So disassociation, people will hang on to spirituality through disassociation and through externalization and materialist spirituality, and they haven't yet flicked inward and realized that none of that makes sense. It's all within. Okay, it's all within. So there's a massive shift that has to happen inside people, humanity, where they come to realize the appropriate kind of spirituality for our level of development, right? Nothing is stagnant. The soul evolves. Humanity evolves. That is law. That's the point. Okay? So, Carl Jung calls this, the psychological term is individuation. So, for those that are interested, Carl Jung has different writings on individuation, and that is the psychological term for this. And usually it comes to maturity in the individual by the age of 35, in the average human being. And the consciousness soul is associated with the brain. It's when the brain becomes really active, and the center of the consciousness soul is in the human brain. So there's a really fantastic quote from Romanticism Comes of Age by Owen Barfield. And he talks about the kind of loneliness of the consciousness soul, the difficulty of humanity having to individuate now. And he says, living in the consciousness soul, man experiences isolation, loneliness, materialism, loss of faith in the spiritual world, and loss of faith in the spiritual world. Above all, uncertainty. The soul has to make up its mind and to act in a positive way on its own unsupported initiative. I'm going to read that one more time. So the consciousness soul has to make up its mind and act in a positive way on its own unsupported initiative. So basically, you're using your sensory perception of the sentient soul and your thinking, but now you basically have to make really difficult decisions about what you should do. And in a hive mind, you don't really have to do that. So this is the difficulty of the consciousness soul, is trying to make positive decisions in your life through really an unsupported initiative. You don't know how it's going to go. You have to make mistakes. It's going to get messy before you understand. So he also says, and it finds great difficulty in doing so, for it is too much in the dark to be able to see any clear reasons why it should, and it no longer feels the old instinctive promptings of spirit within. So again, there's this darkness that can happen where um, everything has shifted within the human being to go inward, but there's that mourning of the old way that we used to operate. Okay. The second phase of the consciousness soul I associate with finally kind of getting over that hump. And this is when the individual has made enough decisions that they begin to trust themselves. They begin to trust their intuition. They've taken the leap, they've made the mistakes, and now they're at a point where they have some level of trust in their intuition and they're moving forward. This is when, during the consciousness soul phase, we see selflessness. We see people sort of becoming motivated by higher ideals. Morality starts to become important. um, the relationship with God begins to become the most important thing in their life, when in the past it may have been like acquiring a bunch of resources or becoming famous or whatever that may be. Um, so the spirit is finally felt again. The great spirit that they felt outside of themselves in earlier periods is finally felt within their being. They went through the hard stuff and they finally feel God within them. But now it's in a different way. Now it is part of them. Okay, so in earlier periods of development, God was not yet conscious within us. We're made of God, but the God Christ element was not yet inside of the human being. So there's a distinct shift now with consciousness soul where that is there. And so there's sort of personality changes associated with this phase, where the individual becomes much more motivated by, benevolence and spirituality. All right. What is going on? It's gonna some random thing. I don't even know how that's happening. Someone was like randomly calling me on my laptop. I have no idea how that would even happen. Anyway, okay. So I'm going to read to you what Rudolf Steiner said in GA 58 about the consciousness soul and the sentient soul, just to kind of give us a much deeper picture. And he says, whereas the overcoming of anger educates the sentient soul, and the striving for truth educates the intellectual soul. Okay, just 1 second, guys. Okay, the volume is low. Let me see if I can raise it a little bit. Stick with me, guys. I don't know why it does this sometimes. Okay. Not sure I can. Okay. All right, guys, sorry about that. I have adjusted the volume, so you let me know whether this is better. Um, that's the thing about throwing all of your stuff in a vehicle in an emergency evacuation is you're not sure what is getting jostled around. Also, where we are, um, there's all kinds of there's all kinds of like strange gadgets and stuff like buzzing and beeping. So you guys let me know if this is better, okay? I have it all the way up. I know there's a bit of a delay, so I'm just going to carry on and I'm going to watch my messages to see if this is all right. Okay, so back to the consciousness soul. So we were talking about how Rudolf Steiner was describing these different soul developments. So whereas the overcoming of anger educates the sentient soul, and the striving for truth educates the intellectual soul, reverence educates the consciousness soul. So a feeling of reverence is what evolves the consciousness soul into yet an even higher soul expression, an even higher level of initiation. So bringing more and more knowledge within its reach. So it's actually the reverence that deepens and brings knowledge to the consciousness soul. But this reverence must be led and guided from a standpoint which never shuts out the light of thought. When love flows forth from us, it ensures by its own worth that our self can go with it. So there's no loss of self with this reverence. Sometimes when people, like even, I hear this a lot in modern spirituality, because our goal is to develop our I, people become very protective of it. Because our goal is to become an individual and develop that, we instinctively know that we have to stay an individual. And there's this incredible paranoia that, you know, if you have reverence for Christ or a teacher or, you know, the spiritual hierarchies, forces greater than yourself, then you're like losing a piece of yourself. That by you thinking something's greater than you, especially God, that's going to somehow take away from your individuality. That's going to take away from your development. But that just shows that your sense of individuality is at a fragile state, because the reality is that, you know, when we have reverence for God, for Christ, for the spiritual hierarchies, for beings that are greater than ourselves, that actually has the opposite effect. It actually brings forward our true self, our true individuality within us. It actually deepens our spirituality. It's funny how that actually works in the spiritual world. So reverence and acknowledging, you know, beings greater than yourself makes you a stronger, more attuned, and advanced individual. And this reminds me of like how you'll hear some people say that all you need to evolve is just like pure gnosis. Like all you have to do is have all of this knowledge and crack the code of how the universe works, and then you're going to like reach this advanced state. That's a complete Luciferian lie. You have to revere what is greater than you, who is greater than you. And that is actually what brings forth those aspects and qualities within yourself. So there is a distinct trend within modern spirituality where it's like people don't want to like acknowledge Christ or acknowledge the spiritual hierarchies, acknowledge angels and humanity's role in the spiritual hierarchy. They want to be they human beings often accidentally place themselves as the center of the world because they're so afraid of losing their individuality. So they'll place themselves as a god. They'll make themselves a god out of fear that if they were to acknowledge Christ, or they were to acknowledge the spiritual hierarchies and angels, these higher beings than ourselves, that they would somehow be less. And so that actually comes from a very deep insecurity. And it's actually a sign of deep spirituality to acknowledge our place in the spiritual hierarchies, our place in the 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 cosmos, basically. Right. I think I can move it a little up. It's fine. Oh, good. Okay, I don't want to mess around with it. You know, sometimes I've discovered that you just need to plug it in again and unplug it. All right, great. So, this idea that you're a god, this idea that knowledge is all you need, not acknowledging initiation science, that the I actually has to be completely integrated into the being, and humanity's place in the spiritual hierarchies, you know, all of those things are distortions when the consciousness soul is achieved but not developed properly, because the consciousness soul needs reverence. You have to have reverence of something greater than yourself and your place in the spiritual hierarchies, but that doesn't mean that you're going to lose yourself. It's the opposite. When you don't have reverence, that's actually when you lose yourself, because you have no sense of where you are in anything. Okay, so let's get back to the Steiner quote. When love flows forth from us, it ensures by its own worth that our self can go with it. So it is our ability to love, to feel love, and have love within our being that protects us from losing our individuality, actually. And it is part of us having reverence. We When love flows forth from us, it ensures by its own worth that our self can go with it. And this applies also to devotion. We could indeed lose ourself, but we need not. That is the point. And it must be kept especially in mind if an impulse of reverence enters into the education of the young. A blind, unconscious reverence is never right. The cultivation of reverence must go together with the cultivation of a healthy ego feeling. So here he's adding that, especially when children are young, they should not be taught that, you know, to revere people without also developing themselves, having a healthy ego. Let's go a little bit deeper into Rudolf Steiner's description of reverence and how instrumental it is for the development of the consciousness soul. So, love and devotion together make up reverence. We can have a devoted attitude to this or that unknown if we have the right feeling for it. Devotion can be enhanced, but it does not have to be divided up or multiplied when it is felt for a number of beings. Since this is true also of love, the ego has no need to lose or disperse itself if it turns with love and devotion towards the unknown. Love and devotion are thus the right guides to the unknown. So love and devotion here is like a protection for entering into topics that you don't understand, or um, you know, when you're uncomfortable in your spiritual experience. Okay. Love and devotion are the best educators of the soul in its advance from the intellectual soul to the consciousness soul. So that establishment of love, devotion, and reverence is key in our phase of development. So during the phase of the consciousness soul, the individual must take up a distinct shift from constantly projecting themselves outwardly into the material world and feeling as though they're kind of like in this group think around the material world, to now looking inward and realizing, okay, spirit is within me. Okay, the spiritual world is within me, and it's through an inner process rather than an external process that I'm going to really evolve and understand that. If the individual refuses to turn their focus within, then they will experience incredible feelings of loss, pain, and loneliness because they're not evolving with the planet. They're not evolving with the life wave, with humanity, and that causes great pain and loneliness within the human being. The consciousness soul requires the changing of gears or orientation from externally oriented to internally oriented. It requires that. From a material orientation to a spiritual orientation, that is required during our phase of consciousness soul. The consciousness soul is the phase of evolution in human consciousness where we find self-awareness and our true self finally begins to emerge in our being. Our higher self finally begins to take root and emerge in our body. This is where the soul is felt in a human being. So because we're talking about NPCs and soulless people, at the level of consciousness soul is when you start to see that this person has somewhat of a soul within them, right? Right when they get to that phase of the consciousness soul and they become aware of their higher self, that is when we begin to detect a soul in the human being. The reason being is because that individual is finally become aware of their higher self in the spiritual worlds, and that is then working upon them and within them so we can sense it through them. So any stage before the consciousness soul, it is as though the person has no soul. That is how it appears to somebody who has one, basically, who is at the level of consciousness soul and catalyzing that into higher stages. Okay, so this is where people stop acting like an NPC. This is where the soul is felt. And this is also when the human being can feel their soul and their I within their own selves. They become aware that they have one. They become aware that there's a spiritual world. And you can sense that in someone, right? This is where the soul is felt in a human being, or when a human being begins to express the qualities society associates with having a soul. This is when the I am force is finally able to permeate the human being in a direct way, and the human being is interacting with it. It is a difficult transition to shift from materialistic consciousness to spiritual consciousness. All right, so those were the 3 stages of the soul that encompass humanity's past and present. And now we're going to get into the stages of the soul that are considered the more exalted stages, or where humanity will be in the future. So these are kind of like future developments, if you will. Though obviously there are some people who have achieved this. They would be considered high adepts or initiates or even masters if they have incarnated with a soul that has their sheaths that are attuned to this level. So the 3 higher stages of soul development that encompass humanity's future are called the imaginative soul, the inspirational soul, and the intuitional soul. And these 3 phases can really only be achieved through spiritual training, through directly attuning yourself, through directly working upon yourself, through direct spiritual processes that you engage in with yourself. That's the only way that these are achieved. They're not given to you. You have to build them up within yourself through your relationship with your higher self or your I. The higher self is the I. I just use those two terms because the modern parlance is higher self, but the classical anthroposophical word is I. So all of these three stages, the imaginative soul, the inspirational soul, and the intuitional soul, are achieved through surrendering your lower ego and all of your kind of lower urges that are unrefined, and aligning and attuning with God and Christ within you. All of these stages are achieved through that process. So your feeling, thinking, and will becomes united with God, and God begins to directly express through you. So the spiritual hierarchies begin to directly express through you. And you become sort of like, by the end of it all, you become a completely spiritualized human being. But these are the three phases of that. Kind of like the three phases of exaltation in the soul. Okay. So first is the imaginative soul. Now, the imaginative soul is basically it's really defined and described as having a very clear sense of clairvoyance. It's the ability to begin to perceive the spiritual world clairvoyantly, directly. Okay. And so, just to contrast, there is an old clairvoyance. And the old clairvoyance, which I believe Rudolf Steiner sometimes calls like the old atavistic clairvoyance, was a different kind of clairvoyance than what the imaginative soul is. So earlier clairvoyance, which is associated also in anthroposophy with the old moon stage of humanity, was a completely subjective clairvoyance. So it's clairvoyance, but kind of like the sentient soul, it was based on whether something's effect on you. So based in whether something's good or bad or helpful or not helpful. And so it's a subjective perception of spirituality, whereas the imaginative soul is still going to be a picture consciousness. It's still archetypal, right? But it is more objective than the earlier kind of clairvoyance, because now it's kind of like the redevelopment of clairvoyance, the reopening of the third eye, but now you're an individual. So you have this whole extra process, this whole extra part of you that is now engaging in clairvoyance, basically, and that is called the imaginative soul in anthroposophy, and it's a distinct level of initiation in the human being. It is also associated with a degree of spirit self, or like manas or higher manas in theosophy or the Eastern traditions. That's what it's called in those streams. So in order to get this higher spiritual perception where you're literally beginning to see and perceive overlays of the spiritual world on top of the physical world, if you choose, and those overlays have to be accurate, an accurate representation of the spiritual world, you have to become a moral person. This is what a lot of people don't talk about when it comes to psychic development, is that you're not going to get to the phase of imaginative soul or the clairvoyant soul unless you become a moral person. Okay, if you try to engage in spiritual practices like in black magic, you're going to degrade any progress your soul has. Okay, so more by the time you actually begin to achieve the imaginative soul or spirit self, or manas, your feelings and impulses become more aligned with God and Christ within your being than your lower self. So you have to be more selfless. You have to have, basically morality emerges as a natural impulse. So you're not at a point where you're wondering what morality is or whether it's good or bad. It's become a natural impulse in you. It's sort of a natural instinct at this point. It's integrated in you, and that's what gives you the clear sight and the clear attunement to actually properly perceive the spirit world. Okay. And also, when you get to the level of the imaginative soul, which is also called spirit self, there is, you begin also, because there's a purity to your being at that point, you will have like a direct, impulsive aversion to evil and to cruelty. And there's no like desire to commit evil things or hurt people um, or any of that, because this phase is also associated with the purification of the astral body. So the lower urges become purified. And it's that purification that gives that clear vision. Because how clairvoyance works is that you have your astral body, and then you have your etheric body, and then you have your physical body. Now, your astral body and your etheric body are also called sheaths because they basically surround your physical body like this, but they have different functions. Okay, the astral body is can be seen as like the spirit world. The etheric body is like an assimilation body that you have that unites the physical body with the spiritual world and processes it. So the etheric body is like an organ of assimilation. And so what happens is the astral plane will go like this on the etheric body, and it is projecting pictures onto it of itself. You know, you're experiencing life, you're actually in the 3D plane, but you're also in the higher planes. You're in the material world, but you're also simultaneously in the spiritual world. So all the spiritual information and impulses are hitting you all the time. But once you get to this level of imaginative soul or spirit self, all of those impressions are now hitting your etheric body, and they cast pictures on it, and that's how you see it. So there's pictures that are cast onto the etheric body that are processed through the psychic organs of the third eye. And so this is possible because when you reach the true level of imaginative soul or spirit self or manas in the Eastern traditions, the astral body is purified. So so the lower urges are pretty much non-existent. They've been sublimated, which makes it a pure image is allowed to be cast on the psychic organs. If the astral body is not purified, okay, if the lower urges and sentient soul is not clarified, it's not brought to the imaginative phase, returned to the imaginative phase, then what happens is you get a bunch of basically lower images, you get hallucinations. This is where you get a lot of people who have psychic visions, but the psychic visions are very poor quality. This is where you get dark entities, you know, casting images onto the psychic, and the psychic has no idea it's a dark entity because they don't have their eye developed and their astral body is not purified. So you can be a completely psychic person. It's not a big deal to be psychic. It's not a big deal to communicate with a spiritual being, actually. We all have those organs. It's a big deal to be able to psychically perceive and communicate and be attuned. So attunement is the big deal. That is spirit self. That's the imaginative soul. That's when you actually get clear information. And this is also where many of the great teachers are at this sort of the beginning of the bodhisattva level, is that's how they're able to get powerful information. That's how they're able to be creative, is because they're at this level of development within their soul. They've reached this stage. So it has a lot to do with the purification of the astral body, which is the sublimation of and transformation of the lower centers, and the aligning and attuning with Christ, with God. Okay, that's what creates that level of soul development. And Rudolf Steiner was very, when I was reading the material on this, Rudolf Steiner was very adamant on, you know, saying that these are not hallucinations, because sometimes you'll hear people who don't really know anything about spirituality, and they'll be like, oh, this person has mental illness and they're hallucinating and they're just seeing things. And so it's like, it's incredibly important to distinguish between a kind of rapturous hallucination or even like demonic messages that come from basically someone who's not properly attuned yet doing it anyway, kind of thing. And someone who is attuned, has that purified body, and is actually communicating with higher forces, right? So this is what Rudolf Steiner said about the difference between psychic hallucinations and lower clairvoyance and real, genuine clairvoyance. He says, and this is from Fruits of Anthroposophy, which is GA 78, Imaginative Knowledge to Inspirational Knowledge. They are not something similar to a vision, a hallucination, or the like. They're not a hallucination. Imaginative consciousness is not a hallucination. On the contrary, they lead man's soul condition in the opposite direction from that which moves when it falls into visions and hallucinations and the like. Imaginations of cognition are healthy soul experiences in the same sense in which visions and hallucinations and so on are sick soul experiences. So when you have a clairvoyant experience or a psychic experience from the level of spirit self and the purification of the astral body, that is a real psychic experience. When that stage is not achieved yet, it is a sick soul experience. It comes from actually a sickness in the soul. And this has to be mentioned, and it has to be said again and again and again, because it is very common in our modern times to think that if someone can just get a prediction right, or if someone can communicate with a deceased relative, or someone can communicate with a spiritual being or something, that automatically means they're attuned, that the act itself represents some kind of attunement, and that's not the case at all. There is good psychic information, and there is bad psychic information. There's sick psychic connection that connects to the lower astral plane and dark things, and there is exalted psychic connection, which is helpful and fruitful, and is quite frankly a stage that all human beings must one day get to should they want to evolve. Is to be, we all eventually, humanity eventually has to be able to perceive the spiritual world. We come from that world, and we must, through our own efforts, build ourselves back up and transform ourselves, transubstantiate matter back into the spiritual world. That is required of us to evolve. So all human beings will be at this level in what is called New Jerusalem in esoteric Christianity, or the cosmic word for New Jerusalem, and the anthroposophical word is New Jupiter. And this is when we basically have, the phase of New Jupiter is like a higher recapitulation of the old lunar phase of humanity. So it's kind of like this regained etheric sight, an astral sight, but from a yet higher exalted place of an individual. Okay, so the imaginative soul has clear clairvoyant vision of the spiritual world. The person with their imaginative soul developed can perceive symbolic pictures of the spiritual world overlapping the physical plane. This can only be achieved through moral attunement and the purification of the lower self via the conscious influence of the higher self. Imaginative clairvoyance is real clairvoyance and should be discerned from hallucinations or clairvoyance that emerges from poor attunement. When an individual has achieved this degree of soul development, they are seen as an exalted human being with an abundance of soul power. So we began this lecture by talking about people who apparently, allegedly, don't have a soul. Okay? Now we're actually talking about people who have a soul, and that soul is of a very high level of attunement. Okay? So we're actually going beyond soulless, and we're going into where humanity is going in the future, what humanity is capable of, how the soul can evolve through proper attunement and integration of your higher self into your being throughout your life. Okay, let's move on to the next soul degree. This is called the inspirational soul. The inspirational soul is the kind of the glorification of the mind and the attunement of the mind to God and Christ within you. So, the inspirational soul is when your thinking process becomes spiritually informed. Okay, you begin to think pure thoughts that represent the genuine laws of the cosmos. Thoughts directly express the spiritual hierarchy, so you're kind of thinking with a cosmic consciousness kind of thing. And how it's described in Anthroposophy is that when the inspirational soul starts to come alive in a human being, it feels like you're waking up from a dream into heaven, basically, as a real individual, because the imaginational soul is still a picture consciousness. It's still representing the spiritual world. The inspirational consciousness is now a direct kind of knowledge and interaction with it on a much deeper level. So it feels kind of like waking up from a dream into your true self, into your true being. That's how it's described in initiation texts. Now, to achieve this level of inspired thought or the inspirational soul, you have to release selfish thinking. You cannot get to this degree of soul development if you are continuously trying to relate everything back to yourself. It's not possible. You have to reach a point where everything isn't always about you. Now, the imaginational soul requires that on a feeling level and on a bit of a more shallow level, but this really requires that. You really have to, think as an angel would think, or think as Christ would think. This is sort of, the thoughts have to be of that quality. So the survival instinct has to be overcome in order to have these kinds of thoughts, because if your lower system's constantly pumping you with fear and thoughts about your survival and what can I get, and your life is around that, then it's not possible for the inspirational soul to come about in you. So you have to have, again, truth at the center of your life here. And that is what evolves your mind, the intellectual soul, into this inspirational soul. Is you have to have truth at the center of your being. You have to be willing to say, maybe I'm wrong about this. And you have to kind of basically break your lower ego into little pieces and toss it away, and be willing to be rewritten over and over again. And that is part of initiation. So you have to say it's more important that the objective truth is expressed and understood than it is for me to be personally right. Can you imagine how society would change if people did that? And that's actually exactly where humanity will be in what is called Venus development. Okay, so in Jupiter development, humanity as at large will reach the level of imagination soul, imaginative soul, just like how Earth is the planet and the incarnation of humanity that reaches consciousness soul. It is in what's called New Jerusalem or Jupiter development that we will all have the level of clear clairvoyance and etheric sight that is imaginational soul, spirit self. Now we're going even further, and we will have what is called life spirit and anthroposophy, or it'll be achieved at the Venus level of development, and it is called Buddhi consciousness in the East. So this level of inspirational soul is called Buddhi consciousness, Buddhi awareness in the East. And this is the level where the human being actually becomes a Buddha. So you think about like Gautama Buddha, this is the level that this individual was at. You have to be at this point of life spirit to become a Buddha. So, and this is something I want to point out as well. A spiritual master is not just somebody who wrote a good book, okay? A spiritual master is not someone who said something cool on the internet. A spiritual master is not someone who actually had an important life full of works that mean a lot. A spiritual master has a distinct level of soul development. That is, if they're a Buddha, they have achieved the level of life spirit or Buddhi consciousness in the East, or they have the level of inspirational soul achieved within their soul. They then incarnate into a physical body with that level of soul development within them. Okay, and they do that for service. So not everybody is a spiritual master. I see these different teachings and whatnot that are completely bizarre, because if somebody has achieved spiritual mastership, that's an actual level of soul development that can be traced and understood through the system that I'm talking about right now. Um, so this is also where we get um, really powerful spiritual teachings on the planet, because at this level, you have clear thinking. You have the ability to clearly understand the cosmos, basically. And so these are the individuals that form the mystery schools. You know, the Buddha formed Buddhism, right? And you have these incredibly advanced spiritual masters that form these different religions and spiritual systems because they are able to perceive the spiritual world objectively. Okay, so that's a very high degree of spiritual initiation, and not everybody has that. So you have to have an advanced soul that has achieved this level, and they have to then choose to incarnate on the planet with that, and it doesn't happen very often. Okay, so when you get these amazing teachings that are teaching spiritual science and talking about the higher planes, and they're very distinct, they're very precise, yes, because the people who brought those teachings were spiritual masters who had that level of consciousness achieved within them, that they had clear clairvoyance, they had their imaginative soul developed, they had their inspirational soul developed, and maybe even the next soul level developed. And so these are the spiritual masters, these are the high adepts that are able to bring these teachings forward because they have the organs of perception to do that. And religions form around them, and spiritual systems form around them. And a lot of people pretend to be spiritual masters, but it's actually rather rare. And there's a difference between somebody who is at a high level of like consciousness soul, or you know, very intellectual, and someone who actually has achieved this level. I want to just make that clear. And again, humanity will achieve this level of Buddhaship, what we would consider Buddha had achieved, at the level of Venus development. So when the Earth reaches the stage of Venus, because the Earth evolution is traced through cosmic phases that are represented by the planetary spheres. Okay, so now I'm going to read to you from GA 145, and the lecture is called The Effect of Occult Development Upon the Self and the Sheaths of Man, and this is from Rudolf Steiner. We also know from what has been said in the previous lectures that thinking self, which is developed principally in the intellectual or mind soul, must be changed. We have heard that thinking must more and more give up developing its own thoughts, that it must more and more suppress personal thinking, the human personality suppressing its own thought. So this is like, you have to go beyond your own egocentric thoughts that serve yourself, your own, like how often do we hear people say, well, you know, and Rudolf Steiner says this as well, you know, how often do we feel when we're trying to get to the bottom of something and find the objective pure truth, someone be like, well, it's just, you know, it's just, this is how I see it. This is, you know, my opinion on it. And then it just goes nowhere because, you know, that individual is not really looking for the objective truth. They're looking to go into the world and like gather up little truths in like a little truth bag that support and bolster their idea of themselves. or their idea of the world that they've created. They're not looking and engaging with people or spiritual literature or any kind of experience from a place of what is the objective truth. If I can find the objective truth, I can discover my true self. They have an idea of the cosmos, an idea of life, an idea of themselves, and they specifically go out and gather up information and teachings that just support their ideology. There's a point in that when you're learning where that's okay because you're trying to learn something, but it has to get to another level where you cannot be out there taking in content, reading books, engaging with people, and then close up and then just say, well, this is my truth. What is the objective truth? There is an objective truth. There's an objective truth to the spiritual world. You know, there is, not everything is just someone's like personal truth. You can have a personal truth and personal preferences and things like that, but there's also an objective truth of the world, right? And a lot of that is driven through understanding morality, but this is a larger conversation. But this is what Rudolf Steiner is talking about when you're suppressing your own thought. It means that you're not trying to center everything around you or constantly bolster your worldview, because again, that means that it's an unstable sort of relationship with your higher self or your I. So when the student is able to suppress that which in his ordinary life he has made of his intellectual or mind soul, then in the place of that which exists in him as ordinary thinking, as reason, as basic reasoning, and also as the ordinary mental life on the physical plane, comes inspiration. So inspiration, in other words, the inspirational soul can only come when you sublimate your egoic desires for yourself. You got to open up. You've got to let that go. You've got to open up. And you have to have something else driving you, okay, other than yourself, your survival, even the survival of the ideologies that you've created for yourself. You have to be willing to die consciously again and again and again. Okay? The intellectual or mind soul changes into the inspirational or the inspired soul. The inspired soul, the inspired works of culture have been received in the transformed intellectual soul as inspiration. So here he's really pointing out that we really begin with a rudimentary organ of thought that's called the intellectual soul, but through higher attunement, that intellectual soul is catalyzed into the inspirational soul, where your mind becomes subject to direct inspirations from God and from the spiritual hierarchies, from Christ. You begin to actually function on a mental level united with the higher worlds. It becomes your thoughts. All right. The inspirational soul now has united the mind with their I or their higher self. They are capable of receiving pure, timeless wisdom of the spiritual hierarchies within their being. When they exercise their clairvoyance, it is accompanied by understanding. So this is something that's also mentioned in Anthroposophy as kind of the process of psychic experience, which is that when you're only at the level, when you're at the level of imaginative soul, or when you get the regaining of your clairvoyance, you're just kind of like looking around and you're seeing pictures. You're seeing spiritual pictures or visions of the higher world, oftentimes archetypal images. When you have the inspirational soul developed, that process deepens. And what happens is when you are doing psychic work, you will get a knowing first, and then with that knowing, then you'll get the clairvoyance. So the deeper you go, the more these capacities stack together and function together. So the imaginative soul, which is which is when we regain our clairvoyance, you don't necessarily get information with that. And I don't mean just any information, right? There can be lower forms of of psychic information. Again, that can come in when you're not attuned. I'm talking real attuned information, okay? So when the individual has achieved the inspirational soul level, that is the level of Buddhi, of Buddha. That's the level of the spiritual master or the saint. In Christianity, a spiritual master is called a saint. That is the level of Buddhaship. That's this level. So that person has their soul developed to the inspirational soul. This is called life spirit in Anthroposophy. This is a distinct level of development. Okay, so we're going to get into the last level of initiation for the soul, which is the intuitional soul. And then I'm going to close this out by going into what could actually make a human being soulless, or is there actually any creature that could be soulless, which is a very important part of this lecture, because in the future, these kinds of things are going to come about. There's going to be a push, especially in the next 10, 20 years, to actually kind of create things, to use the Edgar Cayce terminology, that are soulless. And we cannot see these soulless things as people. We cannot attribute that status to them for spiritual reasons. But we're going to get to that in the third part. We have to finish out with this last level of spiritual initiation, or this last level of soul development, which is called the intuitional soul. And again, we started here with the level of soul development that would be considered soulless, right? The sentient soul, the intellectual soul. And then we got to the consciousness soul, which is where the soul begins to come into the human being. The human being begins to realize, oh my gosh, I have a higher self, and what does that mean? And they begin to come into that. And then the imaginative soul, which is when that starts going and you start to regain psychic abilities we had lost, right? And then we come into the inspirational soul, which is this claircognizance, this like mind power that is united with, it's thinking almost like as God, as the spiritual hierarchies think. And then now we're at the final stage, which is the intuitional soul. Now, the intuitional soul is associated with the stage of Atman in the East, or spirit man in Anthroposophy. And basically, this is an extremely exalted level, but basically at this point, the world's interests become your own personal interests. So you're just operating on an entirely different level. Like your will is aligned with Christ, with God. So everything about you, your feelings, your basic impulses are moral. There's no more, there's no more like, oh, I'm confronted with a situation. What do I do? Is this the right thing, or is that the right thing? There is an immediate instinctual understanding at this level of development, and also going into the inspirational soul, what is moral and what is right. And there's just a natural, it's like just a fact that what is good for humanity and good for society is good for you. There is nothing is good for you unless it's good for all, right? That is a level of the intuitional soul. And that becomes part of their will, becomes part of their basic drive, is rooted in that. There is no more, there is no more indication even within them of this kind of, evil that we would see in before the astral and etheric body are purified. The inspirational soul is associated with the purification of the etheric body. The imaginative soul is associated with the purification of the astral body, okay? So there's no more survival mode. There's no more personal interests. The interest of these individuals is the interest of humanity, and they will do whatever it takes with their life to further the evolution of humanity as they see it connected to their own life. This is where you see, like, Jesus. This is where you see when, Jesus has Christ enter his body and he dies on the cross. This is that level where he has attached his destiny to humanity. And for that reason, the Christ enters him and he achieves that goal, the mystery of Golgotha. This is that level. So this is the level of Christ Jesus. It's also called the spirit man or the Atman level, where when this is achieved, the physical body actually becomes transubstantiated into a spiritual body. That spiritual body is the resurrection body, basically. So, in occult science, again, the purification of the astral body is called spirit self, and the imaginative soul comes about as the result. This clear clairvoyance comes about. Then is the Buddha consciousness, which is the purification of the etheric body. Now we actually have the transubstantiation of your actual physical body down to your bones back into spirit, which is the goal of all human beings, especially by the time we get to what's called the Vulcan development in humanity. So humanity reaches this stage as a group in the Vulcan stage. That's where all of humanity will be, at the Vulcan stage, should we get to that point. But there are certain human souls, such as the soul that was in Jesus, that was able to achieve this and use this to perform a task for humanity. That is the core central point in esoteric Christianity, is understanding this level of development very clearly, so that we can prepare ourselves and use the Christ that is now within us to actually catalyze these higher stages of development. It's necessary to do that. We have to understand this. There is no achieving this unless we understand how we got these abilities, right? So, yeah, that is the intuitional soul. And at the level, actually, I'll read to you one more little paragraph from GA 145 that kind of summarizes these different levels of soul development. And Rudolf Steiner says, in our age, in order to arrive at true clairvoyance, the student must be given the task of so working at his moral development that he shall first take away from his impulses and passions, etc., all that is personal, and raise himself to the standpoint of making the interests common to the whole world his own. So let me read that again. He must raise himself, an individual that wants to reach these exalted states of soul consciousness, must raise himself to the standpoint of making the interests common to the world his own. There is no level of spiritual exaltation. There's no higher abilities available for anyone that cannot do that. There is no you cannot be genuinely psychic and be selfish and be immoral. It does not happen. You cannot achieve these more advanced levels of soul development. Right? And that's why in these lecture series where Steiner's talking about the imaginative soul and the inspirational soul and the intuitional soul, this is over and over again. You know, we have to develop morality. There are no higher stages without that, right? And that's something that I think our world has to start to get a grasp of, right? Because there's all these displays of power that are completely rooted in selfishness. And they work when the issues are basically mundane, about finances or about politics or whatever. But the moment you want to go beyond that and start talking about the spiritual world, that level of consciousness will not work. So we have to rise into a higher way of being, okay? So then the endeavor must be made to teach him really to comprehend himself as I, as an individual, but he must feel this in the consciousness soul. Then the sentient soul, the intellectual soul, and the consciousness soul may be transformed into the souls of intuition, inspiration, and imagination without any danger. So he does talk about how there are dangers when tapping into spiritual planes, when going deeper and deeper into yourself. You have to have the proper attunement, and that comes through um, selflessness, through morality, not at the expense of your I, not at the expense of yourself, but doing it in meaningful, clear ways, not weird grand gestures that are uncontrolled, but finding ways to bring more morality into your life, more selflessness into your life that work for you, and that will enhance your spiritual capacity. Okay? So, at the level of the intuitional soul, the human being's feeling, thinking, and willing is fully attuned to God and a direct embodiment and expression of the spiritual hierarchies. They resonate from inside out the harmony of the spheres. Here in this intensity of soul power, the physical body is transmuted into spirit and the material plane is released. This is talking about resurrection. This is talking about what in the Eastern mysteries you would call the building of the immortal body, the diamond body. That's what this is talking about. This is not exclusive to Christianity, but this teaching becomes its full self through understanding the Christ, because it is the Christ force that actually transforms our sheaths into a glorified, eternal body. You know, people sometimes hear this in esoteric Christianity and they say, well, don't I already have an eternal soul? And the answer is yes and no. So, yes, you have a part of you that is astral, that is a soul, but every time you reincarnate into the material world, you completely forget all of your other lives. You forget your life in heaven before you incarnate, and your soul is actually not integrated, it's not developed. So, it is existing, but it is in an unintegrated, disjointed form. The whole purpose of incarnating into the world is to, through our higher self and the Christ essence within us, is to integrate all of that. And when that happens through integration and healing and development, you build what is called the immortal body or the resurrection body. And then when you pass away, you become eternal, truly eternal, because there is no more having to incarnate in the material world if you don't want to, basically. And there is the full integration of your consciousness into one eternal form, rather than it being fragmented and you have to keep incarnating in the material world over and over and over and over and over again before you can have an eternal life, which is a life that is beyond the material world. Does that make sense? So eternality in the eternal body or the immortal body of the East is basically your full integrated self, spiritualized self, which no longer has to ride the wheel of samsara or incarnate in the material world. That's what eternal life is in esoteric Christianity. It's not that your soul doesn't continue on after death, it's that process of death becomes different when the resurrection body is established. Does that make sense? Okay, now, so I'm going to now get into some larger societal questions about the soul and kind of being soulless or not. And if any of you want to join me for the last portion of this lecture, where I will be taking audience questions, now's a good time to sign up for my private platform. I will disappear here in probably 20-25 minutes, and I will reappear over there and be taking your questions about this topic. I also have, tons. I have like 500 hours of exclusive content over there at this point, of live Q&As. And so I also have forums where you can talk to like-minded people and explore all of these topics with others, and have, like, there's games. It's really fun. So if that's something you're interested in, I can see you there after this lecture. So, can a human being be soulless? Like, there are certain forms that can have human parts, or certain things that can be created, say, in some kind of genetic laboratory or some kind of robot that can have human elements. but these things will not have a soul. So I think a lot of the comments about soullessness actually is kind of a prescience that is realizing that our future is going to be, at least in part, dealing with certain technocratic elite and mad scientists, just like the mad scientists I talked about in my video called The Mad Scientists of Atlantis. We're going to be dealing with these mad scientists again, except it's not Atlantis anymore. It is now our technological age of the consciousness soul of Earth, of the post-Atlantean period. So we will have to confront these sort of mad scientists basically creating these weird forms, creating chimeras, creating robots, mixing humans with cyborgs, mixing humans and animals. This is already going on, and this is something that happened in Atlantis. It's happening now. And so we will have to deal with that, but it has to become a reality right now that we do not acknowledge those things as the same thing as a person that is born as a human being from a woman, okay? Because what is within a created chimera or a cyborg is not the same force that is within a human being that is born of a woman. We are also going to see very bizarre attempts to remove women from society by people who are completely and utterly possessed by the Mars impulse, that want to remove women and basically see women as like feckless and, you know, whatever it is. This is this dark masculine Mars impulse that will seek eventually to just do away with women. You will see it in your life. It sounds crazy, but you will see this stream becoming more and more popular, and probably connected with there was that digital currency guy who was I can't remember what his name was, but it also goes in line with this really process of eugenics that is creating babies without a woman, basically just using women's eggs, but then in an artificial womb. This is also going to create someone that is soulless. Okay, I want to be very clear about that and clear about it right now. So, a human being born of a woman cannot be soulless. Okay, so when a human being is coming into incarnation and earthly life, they actually take, during their incarnational process, a little piece of their mother's essence, okay, her soul essence, and also part of her body to make themselves. And that process is part of how the higher self and the I and the entire soul comes into being. So it uses the woman, it uses the mother's soul essence and physical body, which contains the soul essence, to come into being. Okay, so you cannot remove women. You cannot have some womb somewhere in some warehouse growing a baby that you genetically engineered in some Gattaca dream, right? And have that baby have a normal kind of soul, because the baby has to come through a woman, because the baby's soul essence, the baby's entire being, uses the mother's soul and the mother's body to create itself. So there's an essence of the individual's etheric body and physical body that is directly connected to their mother. It is an expression of their mother. This cannot be done with people who are made in labs, with cyborgs, or, you know, the weird wombs that are in a warehouse growing. Okay, this is some sick stuff, but it's something that we will have to face and the generations after us will have to face. And so we do need to lay down the proper foundation for this, because these things will not be operational as a human is coming through a human mother, okay? That has to be that has to be directly acknowledged. So, in order to have a soul, you basically have to have a higher self or an I. Okay. So you have your higher self, your I, that is in the spiritual world. And it is basically throughout your life, it's sort of like um, projecting itself down upon you. So you're living your life. You have a physical body, you've got an etheric body, you've got an astral body, and then right above you is your true ego, your true self, your I, your higher self. And that is constantly working on you, catalyzing your soul basically into these different phases. Sentient soul, right? Intellectual soul, consciousness soul, imaginative soul, inspirational soul, intuitional soul. All of these different exaltations of our sheaths of our being, of our soul, are achieved through our Christ essence, our I, our higher self, working upon us from the spiritual world. So that is what makes someone have a soul, is you have to have that I that has basically projected itself downwards and then projected itself into a female mother, right? Also, a male cannot give birth properly to a child either. I shouldn't have to say that, okay? There's a special, specific polarity to the female body that allows birth and allows a soul to take form in a baby, okay? So the body forms as a direct expression of the higher self. So when you have your body, you have yourself, you are a unique expression of your higher self, of your I. You're you're perfect in that way. You're special in that way. That when you came to be in your mother's womb, that was literally because your higher self was projecting itself into your developing etheric body like this, certain patterns, and you took on those patterns of your higher self and you created, and your form came to be a very important, natural, organic process that we need to have as human beings to keep us united with each other, united with God, and united with our own evolution. Okay? So the individual that is incarnated, that is incarnating, is using its mother's soul essence and body as a medium to form its material body. Okay, so the mother is the medium in which the baby is literally forming its structure itself. So imagine what starts to happen when, like, the medium is like some machine womb, or there's no medium at all and it's in a scientific laboratory, or it's an animal womb, or it is so on and so forth, these weird, or it's a male body. You're going to get abominations. You're not going to have the proper incarnational process be achieved. There is an incredible desire to play God with these different scientists and technocrats that will create abominations, and you have to be prepared for that, and we have to know why that's not possible. The only way to know that is to understand, you know, how incarnation happens, the role of women, and spiritual science prevents that. A world of these kinds of abominations can only happen in a spiritually illiterate world. If people actually knew what a lot of this, uh, these eugenics plans, these cyborg plans, if they actually saw what they did to the human soul, they would recoil in terror. Okay? All of these abominations, transhumanism, cyborgs, chimeras, artificial wombs, all of that can only happen in a society that is completely spiritually ignorant. That cannot perceive the spiritual world at all and cannot perceive the spiritual world in themselves. Only at the level of consciousness soul that has not risen to the second phase of spirituality. So in modern times, man will defy this law and produce living creatures that are not born of a woman. These creatures will have no soul as we know it. Instead, they will be a conglomerate of individualities that are drawn forth from the eighth sphere or the lower astral plane. They will not be one being, but many lower astral or demonic beings or beings from the eighth sphere that are like gray that use or operate in one body. Because remember, the eye cannot project and create a form of a baby without a woman to use the substrate in which that baby comes about. So I'm going to read that part again because this lecture really began with talking about, what is a soulless person? Can a person have a soul? And so we went very deeply into that and said, well, no, if you're born of a human mother, you have a soul. The issue is that soul may not be at the level of self-awareness, at the last phase of consciousness soul or imaginative soul. It is at a sort of phase where it is not yet self-conscious. So there's a soul there, there's an I that's beaming down, and it wants to invigorate the individual, but it's just not being received yet, and that appears soulless. What I'm talking about here with babies being born in artificial wombs, cyborgs, even to become transhuman, to become something that has these chips in you, you are surrendering your humanity. Okay, that's the reality. You're having different electrical impulses flow through you because you have a chip inside of you. The electricity that flows through your body is not the same as without these devices, and no matter how small they are. These chips, these little nanoparticles, they change the kind of electricity you have in your body. And for more information on that, check out my Electric Apocalypse lecture, where I talk about how electricity that is from lightning or naturally occurring in nature is not the same as electricity created by man. Because part of man's self becomes imprinted on that electricity, and Ahriman can much more easily enter it. Okay? So we're getting into the degradation of the human being, while we're also, through understanding spiritual science, we're also getting into the glorification of the human being and true eternal life, true spiritualization, but then alongside of it is this false mockery of it, with human beings playing God and trying to create chimeras, trying to create babies without women, and all these kinds of abominations that will only degrade society, and quite frankly, in several hundred years, will be a very serious problem that future generations will have to directly confront and deal with. Again, just as we had to do in Atlantis when something very similar happened. So I want to reiterate just one more time that because these babies that are created without women, or cyborgs or chimera human things, because they are artificial in nature, they're too artificial, they will not have an eye because they have not come about through a natural process. There has been no union, no proper union. There is no woman. Okay, it's not a natural process, so you're not going to get that eye that comes down. You're not going to get a higher self that begins to project inwards. So what you are going to get is you're going to have like a living, moving creature that has basically different entities that enter into it from the eighth sphere or the lower astral plane. And this will be greatly helped with when there's these different parts, especially with transhumanism, when the electricity of the body changes due to the transhumanistic impulse. Okay, so that is real soullessness. Real soullessness comes from basically trying to create human beings that's where that comes in. And those will not have a soul, as a human being born naturally of a mother has, basically. I'm not talking about, IVF or anything like that. I'm specifically talking about, um, I'm specifically talking about babies born in an artificial womb. Okay, I know there's lots of questions about that. I'm not going to get into that, but I'm talking about a level of scientific interference and technological interference where the birth process just does not exist naturally on any level. Okay, and then creating chimeras and creating cyborgs and adding parts to people that are machine parts, even small ones, that is where the human being degrades. Okay, so thank you guys so much for joining me on discussing what is the soul, what is an NPC, and getting down into the nitty gritty of really initiation. It was my absolute joy to be with you today. I am now going to disappear from YouTube and Rumble and Instagram and Facebook, and I will appear on my private member site, and I will now take questions. So thank you.